Welcome to Coastal Chronicles of Eastern North Carolina. I'm Dr. Chris Fonville with the Department of History at UNC Wilmington. Today we're visiting Fort Anderson, where the flag that may have cost Abraham Lincoln his life resides. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but Wilmington played a very important role in the American Civil War. Wilmington was North Carolina's largest city and most active seaport. It became the main port of entry for supplies that were smuggled in on blockade runners from overseas. Great Britain was the Confederacy's most important trading partner. But by 1864, Wilmington was the Confederacy's most important city. Robert E. Lee, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, said, "If Wilmington falls, I cannot maintain my army." So Confederate engineers and the Confederate government invested a lot of time and effort, resources, and manpower into building a vast network of fortifications to protect the increasingly growing seaport. Among them were Fort Fisher at the mouth of the Cape Fear River, the largest seacoast fortification in the Confederacy and the site of the two largest naval bombardments. But the largest fort that guarded the interior part of the Cape Fear River, the western land approaches, and the water approaches to Wilmington was Fort Anderson, where we are today. Officially, we're at the Brunswicktown Fort Anderson State Historic Site. It's a dual historic site. Fort Anderson was actually built atop the colonial seaport of Brunswick, which is the first enduring settlement on the Cape Fear River, founded years before Wilmington was. But by the time Confederate engineers came here in 1862, the town was in ruins. And all that remained were brick and ballast stone foundations of private homes and public buildings, and one standing structure from the old colonial town, St. Philip's Anglican Church. The fort is actually made of earth. Pre-war forts were made mostly of brick and mortar, but technology and artillery had advanced to the point where brick and mortar forts were worthless. So Confederates built their forts along the seacoast principally of earth. The material was readily available. It was indestructible. You could fire artillery into it and create craters, but then you could take a shovel and just fill in the craters. So it just made for an ideal construction material. Now, we were standing on the main part of the fort, the major artillery batteries down by the Cape Fear River. Now we're in the area where the first walls of Fort Anderson were built. In fact, you can almost see where the workers would have taken their shovels and put them into the ground to dig the dirt to throw to the backside to build what was called the rampart of the fort. And this first wall ran from the Cape Fear River for 1.25 miles all the way to Orton Pond, and they finished the works in about 6 weeks. Confederate soldiers working alongside enslaved African Americans. The first attack came not at Fort Anderson, but at Fort Fisher. But after capturing Fort Fisher in January of 1865, then Union forces turned their gun sights on Wilmington further upstream. The idea was to capture the city and the river and the railroads to assist General William Sherman's army that was making its way through the Carolinas toward Virginia. U.S. Grant personally came here in late January of 1865 to help plan the attack on Wilmington. And the Union Army commanders and Navy commanders on the scene said, "There's one major obstacle between us and Wilmington, and that's Fort Anderson. It'll be a hard-fought battle, but it's the only thing that we can do to take Wilmington." U.S. Grant said, "Good. It is the best and only thing to be done." So U.S. Grant personally authorized the attack on Wilmington by way of Fort Anderson. So Union forces that had captured Fort Fisher were reinforced in early February of 1865. An entire division of troops, about 6,000 men, was transferred from Fort Fisher to the west side of the Cape Fear River to advance on Fort Anderson, while Union naval forces bombarded the fort on February 17th and 18th. The Union Army moved up toward Fort Anderson with the idea of attempting a frontal assault, only to discover that this was a much stronger fort than they had imagined, and a frontal assault was going to be bloody. So instead, they decided to try and outflank the fort by going around its western end, which anchored on Orton Pond, which is really a lake 5 miles long. So a flanking movement would be a 10-mile detour there and back. Well, in the meantime, 2 brigades of Union forces remained below Fort Anderson to demonstrate as if they were going to attack the fort. The Union Navy was bombarding the fort, hitting it in the area where we're standing now, and then 2 Union brigades are attempting to outflank the fort going around the west end and the west end of Orton Pond. So late on the night of February the 18th, Union forces now were poised to attack the fort from the north. And the weak point of the fort was that side, because it was, like Fort Fisher, only a 2-sided work. So Union forces are now below the fort, firing on it. Union naval forces are bombarding the fort, and now you've got 2 brigades of Union troops poised on the north side to attack the fort at sunrise on February the 19th. So the commanding officer, with authorization from his superior, decided to evacuate the fort. So in the pre-dawn hours of February the 19th, the evacuation order was given. Union forces dug in just below the fort, about 600 yards, heard the sounds of evacuation going on throughout the early morning hours of February the 19th. And as soon as the sun started to come up, at first light, they locked their bayonets on the end of their rifle muskets, fired a volley, and then charged toward the fort, going over the top of the earthen walls in time to capture 40 or 50 of the rear guard that was protecting the main army that was now in full retreat toward Wilmington. But they also found something very interesting. They found a flag lying on the ground. It was the garrison flag that had flown defiantly over the fort during the 2-day battle. Apparently, whoever threw it up on the back of a buckboard wagon, and unbeknownst to the wagon driver, as he pulled out of the fort in the pre-dawn darkness, the flag fell off the back of the wagon. It was lying on the ground when Union forces captured it. An unidentified soldier of the 140th Indiana Infantry found the flag and claimed it as a trophy of war. One of his comrades in the 112th Illinois Infantry later sneered, "He didn't capture a trophy of war, he found it lying on the ground." Well, the soldier turned the flag over to his commanding officer, Colonel Thomas Brady of the 140th Indiana. And then began this flag legacy that may ultimately have cost President Abraham Lincoln his life. We're standing in front of the flag that was captured early on the morning of February 19th, 1865, by an unidentified soldier in the 140th Indiana Infantry. Exactly 1 month later, on March the 17th, the Fort Anderson flag was presented to Governor Oliver Morton of Indiana in an elaborate flag ceremony in downtown Washington, D.C. He was told while in the Washington area that he was to be presented with a trophy of war, a flag captured at Fort Anderson near Wilmington, North Carolina. March the 17th at the National Hotel, in front of a concourse of 2,000 people and a Marine Corps band, the Fort Anderson garrison flag was presented to Governor Oliver Morton in an elaborate flag ceremony. Who should make a surprise guest appearance at this flag ceremony? None other than President Abraham Lincoln, whose schedule actually called for him to be at the Campbell General Hospital that afternoon to watch a play, Still Waters Run Deep, for recovering Union soldiers from the war. But not feeling well that afternoon, he decided instead to accept an invitation to go to the Fort Anderson flag ceremony at the National Hotel, which was only 12 blocks from the White House. What President Lincoln did not know, nor could he have known, was that lying in wait to kidnap him as he made his way by carriage from the White House to the Campbell General Hospital was John Wilkes Booth. Booth had been plotting to kidnap the president since August of 1864. And his best chance came that day when, visiting Ford's Theater, he learned that the president was to go out to the Campbell General Hospital. The idea was to kidnap President Lincoln, whisk him off to Richmond, and then use him as ransom for the release of Confederate prisoners of war so that the South might continue its war effort. But Lincoln did not go to the Campbell General Hospital that day, thwarting Booth's kidnapping plan. When the carriage didn't roll by, Booth figured that he might have missed President Lincoln, and on horseback rode out to the hospital only to learn that President Lincoln had changed his plans and instead had gone to the Fort Anderson flag ceremony at the National Hotel in downtown Washington. So Booth rode back to the place where his co-conspirators were waiting to kidnap the president, aborted the mission, got on horseback and rode into Washington to the place where he was staying, which just happened to be the National Hotel. He rode up in time to hear President Lincoln making remarks, because after being given the flag, to the great cheers of the crowd below in the streets, Governor Morton immediately turned the ceremony over to President Lincoln. And there in the crowd of people was John Wilkes Booth, the famous American actor. Booth seethed with anger as Lincoln talked. He had missed kidnapping him, and from that moment on, of course, his plans would change, and Lincoln's ultimate fate would be assassination. Exactly 1 month after the Fort Anderson flag ceremony, John Wilkes Booth would assassinate President Lincoln at Ford's Theater on April 14, 1865. So the question is, what role did the Fort Anderson flag play in the death of President Abraham Lincoln? Thank you for tuning in to Coastal Chronicles of Eastern North Carolina. I'm Dr. Chris Fonville with the Department of History at UNCW. We'll see you again next time.